But first, let's talk about the BBC. They're down covering the G7 summit in Cornwall. It's a big event, and of course you send a few staff down there. But the BBC's got this terrible reputation for sending, like vast numbers of people. As I said earlier, when they covered the Olympic Games in China, they sent 765 staff there, and they got so criticised that they cut right back for the Rio Games, the last Games, and just a mere 455 went. Why is John Sopel, the American Northern editor who lives in America for the BBC, why is he in Cornwall? Funny enough, he was sitting at a table with his crew enjoying the scenery and a drink last night, so it's good to see they're working hard. When Joe Biden and Jill Biden turned up, and they had to clear the table. So there's all these pictures of John Sopel and the gang hurriedly sort of getting out of the way. By the way, FYI, Joe Biden had a drink of Coca-Cola and Jill Biden had a glass of red wine. Interesting. And to be fair, John Sopel brought us that news, so he's already getting exclusive information, so perhaps that does justify his presence. I don't know. Of course, we did ask the BBC how many staff they sent to Cornwall, and they won't tell us. So it's typical BBC, secretive organisation. Why not? We pay for the BBC. You should tell us. We're a press outlet, and we want to know how many staff you've got down there. And for all I know, it could be a very fair number of staff. It's not like Sky News haven't sent anyone down. Everybody sent people down there, obviously. But my bet is the BBC will have sent sort of at least twice as many as anyone else. They always do. They have so many people doing jobs that could be done by a handful of people in all sorts of areas. It is very overstaffed, the BBC. Let's talk to, from the Freedom Association, Andrew Allison. Good evening, Andrew.
Good evening, Kevin. It's a pleasure talking to you at 7:30 p.m. rather than 7:30 a.m. So enjoy your lie-in tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's the first one for about a year. I can hardly handle the concept, I'll tell you. Yes, so we did approach the BBC to try and find out how many staff they have down there, because we suspected. I've been looking at it. I'm watching it now. Last night there was Laura Kunsberg, Christian Fraser, what's his name, Andrew Lansdowne, and they were all sort of talking to each other. I saw at one point two BBC staff guys standing by a Cornish harbour, very, very picturesque, very atmospheric, glittering in the background, talking about the history of Cornish smuggling. Very good, interesting stuff. But is it really necessary? My bet is they've sent at least twice the number of staff than any other organisation, and guess what? They won't tell us how many.
Well, quelle surprise, as President Macron may well have said in Cornwall today. We know when there's any major protest, any major event in London, the BBC has crews from the BBC News Channel, from the 6 o'clock news, from the 9 o'clock news, from Newsnight. BBC London will cover it. And that's not even to mention Radio 4 and 5 Live. It's always overkill with the BBC. And you mentioned presenters and editors and correspondents talking to each other. That's basically BBC News, isn't it? I mean, if after your show this evening, listeners want to tune into the BBC 10 o'clock news, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but if they want to, as an educational exercise, if for nothing else, you will get the Home Affairs correspondent having a chat to them. You'll have the North America editor who isn't in North America, because obviously nothing is happening in North America at the moment because the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada are in Cornwall. But he'll be chatting with them. I can guarantee the economics editor will be talking to them. I can guarantee that the political editor of the BBC will be talking to them. And that is basically BBC News. That's all they do. They talk amongst themselves.
Yeah, and lots of them, and they seem to have moved en masse to Cornwall for this week. The expense will be enormous, as I said earlier, 765 of them went to cover the Olympic Games in China, which is just grotesque, to be honest with you. 455 covered the subsequent games in Rio. That's the BBC's idea of really scaling back. Why do they cover events like this on such a huge scale? Most of these staff are not necessary. I mean, and as you say, Andrew, it's reflected in staffing levels in their headquarters as well. Why is it so overstaffed? Why can't they do something about it?
Well, because because they have so much money through the license fee. They're awash with it. I mean, they complain sometimes that they're skint. And when it comes to news coverage, where do they have the cuts? They have the cuts in the regions, in local news. You can guarantee that your local BBC radio station will bear the brunt of any cuts that are going on. The cuts are never there in Broadcasting House. They're never there at the centre. And Tim Davie, the new Director General, is promising change. Even in a personal email to me, he promised change. Well, where's the strategic direction then, Mr. Davie? I mean, you should be leading from the front and saying that this is just completely unacceptable. The BBC is far too big. It needs to be slimmed down. We all know that, but there isn't a will inside Broadcasting House to do that.
You see, if I was working for the various newspapers that I've worked through during my checkered career, and say I was based in America, which I was actually for 10 years or so, and the president, in this case Joe Biden, was coming to Britain for a summit, I would say to my bosses, I'll tell you what, I should be there because I can bring my American expertise. In other words, me trying to get a nice free trip back home on expenses, and they would turn around to me and say, "Yeah, nice try, Kevin. Stay where you are. We don't need you." It doesn't happen at the BBC, does it?
No, that never happens at the BBC because, as I said, they just simply have too much money. I mean, they're not short of anything, and they just don't seem to care. And that's another thing. Despite all the platitudes, and we've had the whole thing to do with Martin Bashir and his very underhand and perhaps even criminal ways of getting that interview with Diana, Princess of Wales, but nothing ever really changes, does it? No. Nothing. There's no scandal seems to make any difference. Nothing changes the BBC.
And I would like a bit of transparency. My producer went to the trouble today of phoning the press office to say, how many staff have you got in Cornwall? And it was all, are you a member of the press? Do you have to be a member of the press? And of course he is a member of the press, but then they said, well, you have to send an email. That email, trust me, would have got lost in a very long system. So we are the license payers. We are the press trying to get some transparency for this publicly funded organisation, and they don't tell us the truth. Why do you think that is?
Because, again, I just don't think they're interested in transparency at all. I mean, I could have done exactly the same. I have a press card too. And I can guarantee they would have told me to send in a Freedom of Information request, and the Freedom of Information request would have been delayed, sometimes for months and months. And you eventually find out when no one's actually interested in it, and then they're interested in giving you that information. They just do not care, Kevin. And that is the problem. It is the way that they are funded that leads to this. And the only way that we can ever get any real change inside the BBC is if it's a much more slimmed down organisation and it is funded in a completely different way.
Yeah, they take our money and they spend it like water, basically on themselves. You're absolutely right, Andrew. Always a pleasure to talk, and a particular pleasure to talk to you in the evening. Andrew Allison there from the Freedom Association. I'm Kevin O'Sullivan, and this is the home and the zone of free speech and common sense. Talk Radio.